Co-author of the Maya Chronicles of the Maya Kings and Queens, which has recently come out in a new and beautifully revised edition from Thames and Hudson, and I strongly recommend that to you. He is also, as I mentioned, co-curator of the Maya 2012 exhibition here on display at the Penn Museum until January 13th. So before the end of the world, you'll definitely want to go see it. And then after New Year's, you can come back and see it again. He is also very much in the throes of finishing his doctoral thesis. He is in the program at the Institute of Archaeology at University College London. And we are very much in anticipation of the completion of that work because it will truly be an important contribution to political anthropology and Maya history. This evening, his presentation is entitled Maya Majesty, Kings and Queens of the Classic Period. Please welcome my good friend and colleague, Simon Martin.
Well, okay. Well, just a very tiny word. I haven't really had a chance, not in public, to pay tribute to Loa and the time we spent together during the show, because however painful, however grueling, however lengthy, doesn't matter how long the meetings went on, there was always a cheery face dragging us up and encouraging us, and it was a real pleasure sharing that experience with her. Okay, so this evening we're going to talk about Maya Kings and Queens, and we're going to talk about them in a very particular context. And that is the context of royalty and kingship as a general anthropological and historical phenomenon. We tend to kind of just wash on by the idea that we have kings and queens. But the question must be, what do we mean by kings and queens, and what makes them a king and a queen in some generalized sense, given that the New World has been isolated from the Old for such a long time? These are completely indigenous, native creations of ideas and traditions. And so the way that they overlap, the way that they appear to merge, the way that they have strong resemblances to phenomena from the Old World is interesting. And we're familiar with the great images of these very complex, brightly coloured in many cases, figurines, sculptures, reliefs, which are all portraying sort of the idea of majesty, the glare, the gaze of majesty. But as historians, as art historians, as epigraphers, archaeologists, our task is to try and get deeper and understand the principles, what's underlying these things, and where and what these resemblances mean. So I'd like to pick on a few things which I'm going to just sort of select a bunch of different potential similarities in terms of royal symbolism. So first of all, we have the crown, we have the scepter, we have the throne, and we have armament. And if we were to track those across the world, we'd find enormous amounts of similarity. These are repetitive themes when it comes to not just the personal authority of an individual or a family, but their relationship to something bigger, to the world of divine. And then also, we have various forms of royal performance. So there are the idea of ceremony, or of ritual, which is in some way engaging with the supernatural, with the sort of the implication of all those arts, which is that you're actually involved in ritual. You're involved in defense, you're involved in expanding the frontiers and the power of your polity. And then the idea of courtly behavior, the way in which there are certain kinds of expectations of luxurious living, and the accoutrements and the said luxuries that go with it. So let's start at the beginning historically. How do we even know that the Maya had kings and queens? We have to move to what is now rather overgrown and singularly unspectacular series of ruins. But as we throw ourselves back in time, we have to realize that talking about the Acropolis and the palace, great palace of Piedras Negras in Guatemala. Those of you who have any time wandering around the museum, currently in the archives hallway, there is the original of this painting, created by Tatiana Proskourenko, a scholar who started her career here at Penn, doing these very same kinds of architectural illustration and reconstruction, really aiding. This is a preliminary to all that computer graphics and CAD and the kind of systems that we use today. But of course, the 30s, the 40s, and the 50s, it was illustration that brought these places to life and helped us to understand them. Proskourenko started, as I say, as an illustrator, and her next move was to explore Maya sculpture. She wanted to understand chronology. She wanted to be able to track how individual tiny sort of features and designs in monuments like this one, which stands up in our gallery, changed over time. And she thought that this might be a way of dating undated monuments. So we were relying on Maya chronology, calendrics that appear in the hieroglyphic system. But there are many, many sculptures where that's eroded, damaged, or simply never present. And she hoped to create this sort of vast system for understanding style change. Very, very ambitious study, published, I think, in 1950. Well, that work is sort of pretty much abandoned, and I have to say, really nobody pays it any attention anymore. But in the process, she did something much more valuable, because in her work, she focused her time on not just stylistic changes, but the way in which different motifs interacted with hieroglyphs that appeared on the sides of monuments. And particularly this one here is the motif of the seated idol, as was believed at the time, and priest sort of worshipping. Now, we've moved on so much, it's easy to forget that at one time we believed that the Maya were peace-loving, that they were ruled by priests, a whole series of ways in which the Maya were exceptional. This was true American exceptionalism. And it didn't really bear any relationship to history in the past. And Proskourenko was really the first person to put her stamp on the way in which those things were not just unlikely, they were untrue. She focused her attention on two hieroglyphs, called the initial event and the inaugural event. And these were placed very particularly in the chronology of the hieroglyphic text on these monuments. She also looked at monuments as groups. So here we have what she called Series 1, Series 2, Series 3, and these were monuments which were clustered together. And this was central to her analysis, and very, very fortunate, because in truth, these kinds of clusters don't exist anywhere else. Piedras Negras is the only place that she could have made this kind of insight. So what she determined, in fact, also been guessed by Charles Bowditch back in the early part of the 20th century, is that if you look at these groups of monuments, the number of years that they cover in total is about the length of human lifespan. Proskourenko went a lot further. She identified an event which basically kicked off and was the first contemporary event recorded in the inscriptions. This was preceded by 12, 22, 28 years by another event, this initial event. And she simply guessed that the first one was the birth of someone, and that this one here, she called the toothache, was the accession to power. So pretty much a pure out-and-out guess, but absolutely correct. She could then, there's a tiny change there, speculate that really and truly we're talking about individual kings. And she was able to identify the individual hieroglyphs, which named those people. We can now have quite a stab at actually reading them phonetically. In those days, it was just ruler 2, ruler 3, ruler 4, and so on. And of course the dates, once we correlated them to the Christian calendar, we could estimate or know to the single day when those people came to power and when they died. And in a hieroglyph we'll come to in a minute, they all share this single repetitive title which comes at the end of their name phrases. So, since Proskorikov's time, things have really exploded in terms of our ability to read hieroglyphs. Proskorikov and her contemporaries were conducting structural decipherment. And that means that they were using the context of an image and a particular recognizable glyph, where it appeared in certain chronological patterns, to understand its meaning. But this is really not what we call decipherment today. This is a semantic understanding without having a phonetic understanding. Proskorikov wasn't even sure that Maya glyphs represented language, which is sort of second nature to us today, because there really aren't any writing systems that don't represent language. So, here we have the tablet of 96 glyphs at Palenque, a little kind of blast of the spaghetti of Maya writing. And through a series of very, very fine works of scholarship, we've been able to pull those things apart and start to understand them on an individual elemental levels. This is a display of syllables, and those of you, a number of you have seen these things before, but I'll explain them again. Up here we have pure vowels, so A, E, O, U. And as we go down the columns, we're going to see the way in which they form syllable pairings with consonants. So you have ba, cha, localized, ha, ka, ka, and so on. So this gives us one whole level of the way in which Maya hieroglyphs work. They work by combining syllables and vowels to form words in language. If that was all that they consisted of, Maya writing might be relatively simple. But instead, we've got a few hundred of these, which are whole word signs, called logograms. And we have probably 200 or so of the most common ones are deciphered. Some of them on the sort of far ends of rarity are probably indecipherable. But I think we'll still get a little bit further before we're forced to give up. So, well, we didn't start on that, so we might as well do one now. We're talking about, of course, Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, Honduras, El Salvador. And we're talking about the ancient rather than modern geography. These are the kind of sites that most people, when they go to the Maya area, might visit. Tikal, Piedras Negras, well, it's a bit more remote, but it's the site we just talked about. Palenque, very commonly visited, and of course, Copan, where so much of the material for 2012 Lord's time comes from. So a little bit about, now we understand the sort of range of Maya kingship, we can now look back to the very beginnings. Beginnings are always hard to study because they're the deepest buried, their objects were made of perishable materials, so we simply don't have a lot of material that once existed. But these very, very innocuous and rather dull-looking stones are what appear at a site called El Naranjo, which is just outside Guatemala City. Now, if you dig down a bit, you find those things are the tops of monuments which are arranged in long rows, long partnerships of the tall standing ones, the stela, and circular ones we traditionally call altars, and do indeed seem to be used as offering tables. What's so special about Naranjo is that it's so early. We're talking about the beginnings of the site in the middle formative, so from between 1200 BC and 400 BC. And this line began roughly 800 BC. So in Maya terms, this is going back to the first sort of formations of concepts and symbols in the material expression. Now these monuments are all plain, and we believe it's likely from later precedents that they actually recorded time periods. Later on, as we'll see, this changes in terms of the decoration which is added to them. But we have to talk about places a lot more dramatic than El Naranjo, places like Mirador. This is an enormous center, right in the heart of what is today the national parks and deep forested areas of Guatemala. El Mirador is simply the largest mine site there ever was. So we think of Tikal, or we might think of Palenque or Copan. These are relative minnows compared to the kind of construction work that went into these vast temple pyramid platforms. So relatively low population, but enormously monumental construction. And Mirador is not the only one. There are quite a few of these mega centers. So these are the kind of sort of crucibles. This is where ideas about Maya kingship, the practice of Maya writing, all the kind of ceremony that we're going to get used to in the later classic period begins. And this is one of these very early monuments. Unfortunately, it's been looted. We don't know where it comes from. Stylistically, look at the drawing. It has many of these features that we associate with the early period. These kinds of snarling mouths, particularly an Olmec-oid feature, whatever that term in the end means. And we're seeing this association of the kind of the Lord here in some sort of mythic guise, but accompanied with hieroglyphs, which are, in this case, very early and very difficult to understand. But over time, they are, in particular, about ritual which the king or queen is performing. So, in understanding, we now move to so El Naranjo was there in the middle formative, Mirador is in the late formative, and in this period, now coming up to the time of Christ and just a bit before, we're very thankful for the site of San Bartolo. This was only came to light in the 2000s, but it has transformed much of our understanding of that period and given us insights which we wouldn't otherwise get. So this is one of the main buildings at San Bartolo, and this is a building completely covered with the sloping ceiling parts of the interior are covered in murals. Many of you will have seen them in National Geographic. They depict a grand sort of mythic landscape. They explain Maya religion in a way in which the later documents, monuments, never go to that much trouble. They're never that explicit. But here we see the ways in which there are 4 world trees and 4 deities who perform blood sacrifices in front of them in ways that we see snippets of in later texts, but never quite this explicitly. So many of these pieces still need to be fitted together. There's 2 whole walls that currently exist in fragments that we're going to have to eventually put back together. And a block that comes from some of the deeper excavations of San Bartolo and dating probably to 200 years earlier than those murals is this block. Fortunately, at the time, one time I visited the site, it had recently come out of the ground and was still lying under it in a little hut next to the tunnel. It doesn't look very impressive, but it contains something really very special, because this is the earliest Maya text we've ever seen. And dating as this particular stratigraphic position of this block at around 300 BC, it puts Maya writing back into the same early time frames any other writing system we have in Mesoamerica. So we no longer have to think necessarily that Maya writing derives from earlier precedents in central Mexico. It may, for all we know, be the originator. It may actually be the place where writing took off. The text, as with many of these pre-classic texts, is hard to read. But we can read one of them, which is Ahau, the Lord. So here, right at the beginning, and we can't absolutely tell that it's a historical context, but Ahau almost always turns up attached to human beings rather than divinities. Certainly in this context, we're seeing kingship, lordship, and early writing all kind of coming together at the same time. And Ahau, the glyph, changes a lot. But in the later periods, we're familiar with this young lord form, the dot on his cheek. There's a vulture who wears the same headband. We'll be talking about the headband in a second. And this much more abstracted form. These are all logograms, all with the same value, Ahau, Lord. And the title I mentioned earlier on is where we see a connection between lordship and rule over kingdoms, and also the world of the divine. Because we know that the first part of it reads Kohur, which is holy. Then it's followed by the name of the individual kingdom. In this case, it's Piedras Negras, and it's Yochib. And then finally, Ahau, Lord. So it's a compound. This is where they've overlaid one glyph over another, and we have to actually know from context what is the reading order. And we find at Piedras Negras and many other sites that we're not just talking about individuals sort of unrelated to any others. We're talking about dynastic families. This is a ceramic vessel from the region of El Mirador, but it's connected to the snakehead kingdom of Calakmul. There they are there. And it's a sequence of kings. And here they are, the verb is that they're taking a wheel, which is a scepter. And it's recording the dates of their empowerment. 19 different kings on this pot. And not just many kings inside a dynasty, but also many different dynasties. So one of the shifts that took place in the early 90s, 80s and 90s, was the realization that Maya politics are very complex. There's an enormous number of kingdoms, that they're all interacting with each other, and each one of them is a divine, quasi-divine, holy Lord. And it means that we have a landscape of interaction. There's no single empire. There's no great site that rules all the others at any time. Okay, so back to Proskourakov, and her second amazing discovery within one single 1960 paper in the American Antiquity. She also realized that these figures with their long robes are not priests. This is not a god, it's a king, but this is not a priest, it's a queen. And she was able to suggest the glyph for queen, for woman, which we read as Ish, which is a female agentive in my writing. And we recognize it in many places now. So we have the plain form, but also as a female version of those emblem glyphs, of those royal titles. Here with a very lofty title, Kalomte, noble title, Sahal, and another one, Akhun. And it allows us to understand just a little bit about their human family relationships. Here we have enthroned here a queen, it's her name there, can't fully read it, but also her 5-year-old daughter. So dynastic relationships, the understanding ways in which monuments are setting particular families into a political context. Here, they're probably talking about the daughter only because there wasn't a surviving son. And we see queens in these very palatial settings. We'll talk a lot more about these courtly images in a minute. But here you see Ish Mutul Akha. Okay, so what about these repetitive themes? Let's kind of track them and see the way in which they occur and they're treated in the Maya area. First of all, the throne. Enthronement is not simply a concept which we are familiar with in the West as designating becoming a lord. To sit on a throne is exactly what the Maya used as a term for kingship and becoming a king. This is the root is chum. The full form here is chumwan or chumwani, is seated. And there are many different kinds of Maya throne. I've just selected this particular form here, but I could have picked ones with jaguar skin, double jaguar-headed thrones. a whole series of ways in which the idea of the seat is a fundamental way in which power is passed out into control in symbolic terms. So this seating motif we find whether we're in Africa or medieval Europe or the stone of Scone in Westminster Abbey. These are repetitive forms of royalty, forms of royal power. Okay, our friend Napoleon, and here in his sort of imperial finest, and he is there commanding these scepters, all very deeply related very often to Christian symbolism. But the scepter, the handheld object of power, is very, very common in Maya iconography. Here we have the founder of Copan, Kenichi Yashikomo. There he is. And he's handing a form of scepter, a kind of fiery dart, over to his deep descendant, 16 generations further on. Probably the most common form of Maya scepter is the living god Awil, because a bit like the way in which Vulcan and indeed Thor has an implement which represents lightning, Awil, this animated snake-footed bolt of lightning, is a royal scepter. This event effectively is what we saw in that curving codex-style ceramic pot. This is Cham Awil, the taking of Awil. To hold lightning, to be a symbolic storm god, is one of those motifs of rulership. And in many cases, they seem to have actually had obsidian or chert, from flint, forms of these deities. Here you can see these are sort of fused maize gods and Awil lightning gods, very, very expertly chipped blades. And here, just in one single representation, the whole of Maya art, to in fact one of these things being held by a king. The crown. So another repetitive motif we see time and time again wherever you travel in the world. And the Maya loved headdresses. One god, two gods, three gods. It's like 39 flavors, all stacked up. And they use headdresses in a variety of different ways. One of the most important ways is to identify themselves, because buried within this iconography is very often their personal names. We find that with the monument we have in the gallery. The Phidias Negro's king has his name written in his headdress. But the most important material which headdresses are made out of or associated with is jade. So there is a jade jewel, or there is a plated jade helmet. And of course they also associated with quetzal feathers, so the green iridescent form there, which is at least some degree represents a jade-like verdant form. But this is the most important element. Here's a shell which was discovered at Cibanche in Mexico, and it contains these tied-on jade emblems. Here, if we go back, you can see they're actually made out of jade in this representation. And strangely and somewhat counterintuitively, they represent animated paper. When we turned out we could actually read what these things were, they had the name hun. And hun is the word for paper. They're sometimes called sakhun, for white paper. And it seems to represent the actual material, the binding material. So even before the sense that the jade is a precious and gorgeous material that kings will adorn themselves with, is the idea that there's something about paper which carries symbolic power. It's not the kind of thing you get a 500-pack ream of. Paper had to be extracted from the fig tree and beaten. If you, in very ancient times, it's believed it was used for clothing, particularly. It may have been a lot cheaper the weaving of cotton. So Maya kings is a festoon with crowns and emblems which they wear on their head. And these involve multiple versions of the paper deity queen, and lots of beads, jade, and shell, and all these things. Back to Napoleon. Of course, crowns are a bit like with the scepters. It's not just a question of the object itself, it is the acquiring of that object which carries immense power. So various forms of ceremonial, and particularly crowning ceremonies. First of all, we'll have a look at. This comes from San Bartolo, and so it is one of these very ancient events. This is, as I say, about 100 AD, 100 BC is when these particular paintings were made, and we see an old god with this helmet-like headdress, which the lord is about to be crowned. So this is 100 AD, 100 BC. This representation is from about 700 AD. So about 800 years later, we find an old god wearing a very similar cloak or cape. A very similar kind of helmet. This is where the face will go. The quetzal plumes here, the head of an important deity, the principal bird deity, and here the Lord will receive. This is probably a mythic scene, and the last one may be mythic as well. But they are really prototypes of the way in which kings acquire power. Another important aspect of ceremony was the way in which kings would act out the roles of deities. And they did it particularly by dressing in costume, but also particularly with masks. And here you see the king Yashpasachan Yopak of Penn. He's the 16th king. And he's wearing the mask of this bat. And here was just peeked in a bit of the text, where in fact that bat deity is named, and the text tells us that he is impersonating, he has acquired that persona for this particular ritual. Some of these rituals and some of these masking events seem to depict something more than just simply ceremony. It really is merging here into ritual. Because this is the Halbergsstele, this is in the Princeton Art Gallery, another very early monument. We don't quite know how early, but the king is wearing the mask of the rain god, and he is sort of conjured up, probably through bloodletting, a series of mythic creatures and supernaturals. We have a term for that, which is tsak, to conjure. The idea, and it's quite an attractive one, is that catching fish in the hand, which is what we have there, finny bits down here, the fingers, this is the kind of elusiveness with which one has to communicate with the supernatural. It's like catching fish in a river. And we see it here in the phrase. We've gone back to Pieris Negros again. So it's Unsak, and then there's the emblem glyph here. So this is the king Pieris Negros who is conjuring a deity. I mentioned about bloodletting, and here we have the great king Pakal, Kana Pakal of Palenque, and he is brandishing a stingray spike. This knotted deity here. We have an excellent pot in the exhibition which shows gods all with these personalized bloodletters. They get to let blood from their genitals, and that's a treat that he's looking forward to here. But male bloodletting is not the only form. We also, and it's quite well known, quite horrific image, we have female bloodletting. This is Ish Kabal Shok. She is the wife of the king of Yashchilan. Very few women actually reign in their own right. There is a couple of cases But for the most part, we see women as wives and as dowager queens, the mothers of kings. So she is pulling a rope which has thorns attached to it through her tongue. And the blood which is flowing from this is sort of falling into a basket at her feet. This had a big impact on all the thinking in the 1980s with the idea that Maya royalty were obsessed with bloodletting, just general scarification and sort of gruesomeness. But I think, personally, that this image is supposed to shock us. It's not supposed to be seen as a daily event. What they're trying to tell us here is the way in which we suffer for you. We have to do these terrible, terrible rituals and acts on your behalf. It's part of the kind of compact of rulership as to why kings and queens deserve all those jade jewels and those fine meals and things.
You're lowering your voice.
Say it again.
I said you're lowering your voice.
Am I? I'm sorry. I'm trying to talk a bit. Okay, so we're finding here the text that goes with it. As this indicates, we have a pretty good stab at being able to read it all. But it talks about his image, we're talking about the king here, in penance with this fiery spear, which seems to be as a nickname for a flaming torch. And it is the penance of shield jaguar. So this is in some way a sacrifice concept. A related lintel, which comes from directly adjacent to it from this building, shows the kind of results of this bloodletting. We're seeing the queen here with the same kind of bowl of bloodletting materials that was in the previous scene. And here she's sort of conjuring and envisaging the king as warrior, emerging out of this serpent, bony, centipede serpent. There's the stingray spine there, and there's an obsidian bloodletter there too. Here's the king, with armed as the warrior. The iconography of Central Mexico, which is particularly associated with militarism. And here, the text talks about he's conjured the embodiment of the flint and shield of this particular deity, which is a patron god of this site, which is Yaxchilan, not too far from Piedras Negras, and is the holy conjuring of this the king here, stated as being a 80-year lord. So he's been around a long time. Something else that we may think of as sport was the ball game, and Maya kings vigorously engaged in playing ball. Increasingly, with scenes like this one, it looks likely that it was part of diplomatic interaction. We have a number of scenes that show lords from different kingdoms playing ball, and it seems to be the ways in which certain kinds of political relationship was cemented. So we have a Ubah Tapiz up here. It is the image of him playing ball. Okay. So, the life of court and all those sort of luxuries and life of ease that one would expect royalty to have. Buildings like, we find palace-type structures at Yaxchilan. Here's a recreation of what the palace may have looked like at Palenque. Today it's a very, we'll see it in a minute, a very bleached and stony exterior. But originally these things were intensely coloured. Lots of different motifs and even hieroglyphic text painted on them. Here is the plan of the palace at Palenque. So lots of private courtyards, inner rooms, grand ceremonial spaces for receiving visitors. And the best insight we have to what life was like in these places are ceramic scenes, rollouts of cylindrical vessels. So this is a cylinder that has been unrolled photographically. It shows our king here on his throne, surrounded by goodies, food, and items, precious precious items one behind another. Some of the scenes have musicians playing. They're being fanned. Goodies are being brought to them. There's various diplomatic business being done with visiting dignitaries, that kind of thing. And very often we have dwarves. Not unlike some medieval European royal families, there was some concept in which dwarf, smallish people were part of the court, would tend to have very high status, and perhaps acted as jesters and things like that. One of the things that we find particularly in these scenes of sort of royal contemplation is the way in which kings stare at themselves in mirrors. And this is the iconographic representation of an obsidian mirror. And we're fortunate because we have a few of these archaeologically. We know that they were made of either obsidian or iron pyrite, and they're made of these segments fitted together. This gives a very smoky, cloudy reflection. This is not like looking in one of our mirrors. But given that the kings had this contemplative role of communicating with other worlds, we think that they're in some sense seeing into a different kind of dimension by looking at themselves in this way. Now, the concept of the performance or the involvement of dwarves with kingship comes together quite neatly here. We see the band playing just outside the door. We see what we might describe as a real dwarf drinking from this probably hollowed gourd. But up here, facing the king with the same mirror that he's sort of gazing into, is a sort of extraordinarily small figure, which is not intended to be human. We actually have two cases where archaeologically there are wooden figures, very small servant figures, who are presenting mirrors. So this is a kind of sort of, this is a kind of sort of perpetual servant in wooden form. It's a piece of furniture for the court. In the center, this is where the obsidian mirror goes. And where there's a text, this is a different one which is better preserved. We have U-ne-na or U-nen, his mirror. So these things are labeled, they belong to people, they're the personal possession of kings. And so many of those fancy ceramics are also individual possessions, things that they might give away to other nobles, but they're in a sense part of court production. And when a royal court was excavated at the site of Agorteca, we found, well, the excavators found, some really excellent evidence that the high status buildings closest to the royal palace contained artisans who were working in various materials, whether it's jade or shell, with tiny little grinding stones, which probably means that they were making ink for writing in books. So it seems as if this artistic production was one of those important features, one of those functions of the royal court. Militarism. We're very familiar with the idea of kings with weaponry and the symbols of war. And this is no less true of the Maya. As I mentioned before, Teotihuacan, which is central Mexico, is the home of this central Mexican style iconography. The storm god of central Mexico was considered to be a very potent military force. We still don't fully understand all the reasons why the Maya acquired and used this kind of iconography. But I think it has to be based on the idea that Teotihuacan was an impressive, region, historical, famous military power. Another one of these polychrome roll-out scenes, we see the combination of the enthroned king, but here with the miserable captives being presented by his warriors. This is a broken monument, but it illustrates the way in which, even here in this early period, this is a monument from the 360s, we have lords, captives, this title tells us that he's a lord, but bound captives being trampled under the feet of kings. Of course, also, in some of these sort of palace-style structures, we have warfare as iconography, as decoration. This is the great battle scene from Bonaparte. Here is one of these polychrome vessels again, with this motif of grabbing the hand, another symbolic sense of victory over someone. And a plethora of hieroglyphic terms and phrases referring to warfare. This is just one of them. It's actually the earliest to have been discovered. Chu plus ka plus ha makes chukach, is seized. This is the individual term for the seizing of a captive. And we see it kind of kicking in here in this really nicely elaborate scene. This comes from somewhere in the region of Yaxchilan, so not too far from Piedras Negras, and shows the king. But here, he's not in his own royal court, or at least this monument doesn't come from Yaxchilan, because he's on the left side. And my monuments privilege the right side. So whoever is on the right side is the kind of central focus of that particular inscription, that particular monument. So the king is here celebrated at one of his vassal client centers. He's sitting on a throne which contains his name. There are some miserable captives, and between them, the local lord who almost certainly commissioned this particular stone. The text talks about the chukah, the capture of the leading one of those captives, and it's said to be done by this guy, who's called He of Great Monkey. It says that 3 days afterwards, 3 days after capture, were presented his captives to his lord. So this is a presentation event where a client king is giving himself credit and prestige to his ruler by handing over his captives. This is probably the single most important battle of Maya history. It takes place somewhere between Tikal and Kalakmul in the year 695. This is the translation of it. And the pertinent thing is that the flint and shield, or the armaments, the army maybe, of this guy, Yichakak, one of the most famous kings of Kalakmul, the snake site, have been brought down. So his arms and his army are vanquished. And also, we have the capture of this particular entity, which turns out to be a god, because Maya armies, and we have some records of this from the colonial period and just before, Maya armies took idols, the images of their patron deities, into battle, and these might also be captured in the same way as human lords might be captured. So, just a little bit about the kind of politics that this sort of implies. I mentioned this before, Ahau, but it can also be possessed to make Yahah his lord. And this is really the key to looking at the ways in which kingdoms were not independent of each other, but they existed within hierarchies. A stone like this one, again, is on provenance. It's a looted stone. It comes from somewhere near Bonaparte, which is somewhere near roundabouts in Yaxchilan. It tells us that the king of Bonaparte here was a vassal. He belonged to the king of another very powerful kingdom, Toninar. So kings exist in relationship to each other in hierarchies. Another way in which hierarchy is expressed is if we go back to this chum verb, the way in which kings are seated into rulership, ti ahalel. Here we have the name of that king. He comes from a site of Kankuren, in southern Penn region of the Maya. And here we have this sort of supervisory verb, uchabi, that tells us that it's the king of Kalakmul who effectively sets him in power, puts him in place. And if we chart all of these relationships between kingdoms, whether it's hierarchy, whether it's diplomatic visits, whether it's family ties, relationships of marriage between one kingdom or another, and most of all in this context, the red ones, conflicts and warfare, we can understand Maya landscape as this kind of interactive arena where things are constantly in flux. Some kingdoms, and you can see pretty clearly that Cardinal, in its earlier iteration at Sibanche, became particularly adept at manipulating these various kinds of power relationships, almost certainly because it was the most militarily successful. If we take away the others, this is the kind of signature of an ancient Maya power. And this quick view of what Calakmul looks like today. Still one of the most surrounded by a heavily protected forest. So what was it all about? What were these networks of power really trying to achieve? And this sort of links us back to all those goodies in the court, because what we see in many cases when you have a king seated on his jaguar throne is piles of textiles, of shells, of cacao beans, chocolate, of items of jade. You can see all them being held up and presented, these textiles. This all appears to be tribute. And we have a few spellings in the actual word for tribute in ancient Maya writing. So all these networks, all these webs of power, ultimately, we suspect, are in pursuit of economic gain. We even have tiny suggestions here where the king is receiving a bunch of tribute of the accountants, looking at their ledgers, looking at their books, trying to work out who's delivered the right stuff on time. Okay, so the final sort of ways in which Maya rulers and Maya kingship replicates what we see elsewhere in the world is in the tomb. Taj Mahal, of course, no less a world of beauty in its fame, no less a memorial than many others. And Maya buildings, the sort of the tiered platforms that we call pyramids, seem to have had this sort of dual function. And it's not easy to tell which one is which. Some of them were indeed, as we'll see, mortuary shrines, and others appear to be resting places for deities. These sanctuaries up above are sometimes described as the sleeping place of gods. And in every case we've been able to see so far, those kinds of buildings don't have tombs underneath. But many were indeed tombs, and this is one that was an illustration of a site called Rio Azul, and this is one of the tombs at Rio Azul. So it could be highly decorated with niches, which no doubt once carried precious goods, hieroglyphic texts which talk about the internee, the king who was laid to rest there. And, of course, very, very true of Kopan, where we have the final phase of structure 16, and then these multiple versions going down and down and down into the earth to the very beginnings of kingship, Kopan. Here inside a building called Hunal, we have the burial of the founder. Those of you who've seen the exhibition know that we focus on this quite a bit. It's a Penn excavation, and it is a major contribution to our understanding of the ways in which Maya kingdoms could be created. That this individual, Kinichi Yashikukmo, travels from outside and founds the classic Maya site of Kopan amidst probably what was a very non-Maya population. I showed you the plan above the Great Palace at Palenque, and here it is. But no statements or tour of Palenque would be complete without the great Temple of Inscriptions. This is the building that Alberto Rus dug through the floor beginning in 1949 and spent 3 years clearing a staircase which had been densely packed with stone, getting all the way to the bottom, where he found the sarcophagus, a great lid which once raised, and inside here is a sealed coffin. Inside that is the king, Akal the Great. Here with a jade mask, you just see those eyes there and falling off his face. Initially, people weren't even sure who exactly this was. Finally, we can decipher his name, we can put together a whole genealogy for him, we can talk about his exploits, his battles, and his alliances, and these sort of things. Inich Hana Akal is the name of this ancient king. And it takes us really into this, back to this idea of kingship and its connection to the divine. Because if we look at the cover of that sarcophagus, we see this great scene of the ruler emerging from the underworld. He has now gone through his tour into the depths of the blackened world of Xibalba. It's one of the names that Maya called it. And here he's actually being reborn. So here's the jaws of giant centipedes, which are seen as being an opening out of the underworld. He is lying in this offering plate, and out here is springing this world tree. He is being reborn into the heavens. And to finish off, we see exactly the same thing in the monument we've chosen to represent this concept in Lords of Time. Here is the last king, Yash Pasa Chan Yopa of Kopan. He's appearing as an aged maze god. At his head comes a flaming torch, which shows that he's also allied to the lightning deity, the same scepter that he took as a young man. And he is standing on these jaws because he is indeed being reborn from this, as is represented of this column, which originally stood in the gateway of his funeral temple. So we've sort of done our sort of circuit. We've sort of travelled around these sort of icons, these repeating symbols of Maya kingship. And I think what it shows us, and we can go into ever more detail about it, is the ways in which the Maya fit into a common humanity. There are certain cognitive structures, certain forms that develop out of our species, out of our sociality, ways in which people are knitted together and form hierarchies which are based on the family, which are based on certain power relationships between humans as social animals. And in reaching out for symbols to express those things, humans reach for very similar things. They reach for objects of power which they can grasp to demonstrate their status. They sit on seats with precious jaguar skin or made of wonderful jade materials. And all of these things express this common fellowship the Maya have within the full universe of mankind. And with that, I shall finish. Thank you very much for your attention.